Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Live Sound webinar, in which we have the pleasure of hosting two world-renowned sound designers for theater sound, Mr. Peter Hylenski and Mr. Gareth Owen. But before I hand you over to Robb and our host, I would like to set down a couple of ground rules here in the room. Which are the chat is going to be disabled for everybody, and everybody is on mute as well, and video is disabled as well. We will allow periodically, probably 2 or 3 times throughout the webinar, a little section for Q&A. So please use the Q&A section to post and ask actually all your questions for the webinar, right? So all that said, I'm going to hand you over to the host for today, Mr. Robb Allan. Robb, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, Peter. Hi, Gareth. Thanks for joining us. Great to have you here. Before we get into some specifics about audio, and I know we got so much to talk about, I guess it's the elephant in the room for everybody in the world right now, COVID and the lockdown. So Peter, where are you? Where are you locked down? Where are you at the moment?
I'm about an hour and a half north of New York City right now. So I'm out of the city and hunkered down here.
Working on your guitar skills.
That's right. If only. Yeah, ever since the Broadway shut down, I pretty much escaped out of here. So, yeah.
So what was the show you were working on when it shut down?
We had just done the first day of cast on stage and sound checks for a show called Sing Street, based on the movie. And we were able to have a really fun send-off. We had the cast on stage, instruments going, and we did a little mini concert, if you will, and then got the shutdown notice. So,
okay. So Gareth, I can see by your backdrop where you are, but maybe you can tell us it's a real backdrop. It's not one of them pretend ones that people post.
It's actually a real backdrop. I'm in New York City. We made the very intelligent plan to move the whole family to New York for a couple of Broadway shows back to back, but we thought it was a really good idea to move in January for like 8 months. That's worked out really, really well.
What show were you working on when it all kind of ground to a halt?
We were about halfway through a new musical called Diana, about Princess Diana,
okay.
Which actually turned out I really, really enjoyed doing. It's all the same creative team that we did come from away with, and it's guys from Bon Jovi doing the music and stuff. So it's actually really quite good fun. But yeah, we were about halfway through previews, you know, started beginning to tie up loose ends, kind of get things a little bit better, and then bang, it's all closed. So yeah, that was not a good day.
So, you know, crystal ball, what's the feeling? Have you got any inside track? When is Broadway? When is West End opening? It seems to be a lot of pressure financially on theatres. I can see that some theatres in the UK are struggling to maybe even reopen after all of this. Any insight?
I don't know that there's. I think we need to let the rest of the world start to open up a bit before we can really take a yardstick to our industry specifically.
Yeah.
I think there was some article released yesterday that said maybe Broadway in January. But it's just tricky because of the financial model of what we, in all live performance areas, whether it's a concert, movie, theater, or a musical theater or a play, we all follow the same rules of trying to get as many people into one room at the same time. So until there's really some sort of an idea of how to make that work, but also financially for theater in general, you can't play to half a house. You can't do 50% capacity and really expect to pay for the theater, the electricity, the rental, the cast, the musicians. You know, it's just the margins are already pretty tight, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. So Gareth, there's like a bunch of virtual theater shows and stuff going on at the moment. In my world, there's a bunch of virtual concerts. How about you? It doesn't quite do it for me. You know, what's your feeling on that? Is that somewhere we're going to have to get involved in?
For me, it feels like virtual theatre and, you know, the recordings and broadcast of theatre is a good stopgap. It reminds people what they're missing. It's not a replacement for the live theatre. I mean, the whole experience of theatre is being in a room, shoulder to shoulder with a whole load of other people, that engagement between you and the cast on stage, but also the audience around you. So, I mean, I feel like there's lots of ideas being proposed, and I think they're great stopgaps, but it is just something to get us through until hopefully we can all be back in the theatre doing what we were doing before.
Yeah, it's the, like, a joke's not as funny when there's not 5,000 people laughing, and that emotional moment in a song or in a theatre show, it's not the same, Peter, is it? It's not. It's something about sharing the experience.
Yeah, yeah. I think that the idea of sharing with a crowd, whether it's in a musical theater, play, concert, there's just something different. You know, you can put on your favorite album and listen to it at home and enjoy it, or watch a concert on television. But when you're in an arena with all these people and everyone's cheering and having a great time, there's something different. And the same thing in the theater. It's, you know, the jokes are funnier, the excitement is heightened. It's just, you're sharing it with people. That's the magic of it. Otherwise, we just all sit at home and watch television, I guess.
There's a couple of great sound engineering examples of this. we were doing a new show, and we were doing a new song with Andrew Lloyd Webber, and it was a comedy song, and he came up to me and said, "It's all too loud." And I said, well, I was thinking, this is weird. He generally likes things loud. And he said, you need to turn it down because the audience can't hear each other laughing. And because they can't hear each other laughing, they're uncomfortable to laugh themselves. And I was like, okay. So we did the song again, and next night, turned everything down 3 dB. Everyone started laughing. I was like, oh, okay, right, that's interesting. And then another great example is when they were doing, Pete, you might be able to tell a story better, but when they were doing Lion King, they put Lion King into this new theatre somewhere. It might have been in Vegas, might be making this up, but it was a really, really dead space, and they weren't getting applause. And so they put in I think it was like a Dimitri constellation. I guess it would have been VRAS at the time. And the object was to amplify the audience applauding so that they applauded more. And again, that kind of shows that people are really interacting with the audience around them, to the point now that I occasionally, in a particularly dead space, will throw in a few microphones around the auditorium and just throw them back into the PA on a VCA, just to get the to boost up the applause a bit. Yeah, the poor man's version of a full-blown VRAS system.
I've even been known to do that in a rock and roll show, just to leave the vocal mics on with all the effects on them, as when the band leave and they're waiting for the encore, the inevitable encore. I just encourage the.
Have you ever done the thing where you leave the cast mics live in the curtain call? So you just let the cast mics sit open so that they pick up all of the audience noise coming back. But it's really dangerous. You have to warn them you're doing it.
Yeah, really.
That sounds more dangerous to me than us kind of mic in the middle of the stage. That mic could be doing anything. So, okay, how obvious question. How did you get into theatre? Let's start with you, Gareth, because you and me go back a ways. We were doing 90s on Oasis tour, so I know that you didn't always work in the theatre world. How did you end up in the theatre world?
Yeah, I came in through the rock and roll route. So I started off mixing bands in a nightclub. I actually bought a book to learn how to mix bands in a nightclub. I knew nothing about it. Luckily, it was a nightclub in the middle of nowhere where no one knew what good sound was, so I just basically got away with it. And
there's a book called How to Mix Sound in a Nightclub. I think
it was called Live Sound by Peter something. And I just bought this book, and it taught me everything I needed to know to get through a night behind a little Allan and Heath desk. There's a few Shure microphones, the SM57 on the snow. That's good advice. There was no internet to ask any of these questions from, so it kind of made it all up. But luckily, I made it up in a world where no one knew what they were talking about. Yeah. And then I ended up working for SSE, which is a big rental company in Birmingham. I did loads of work experience with them. I just basically knocked on their door. I actually lied to them. I said, I'm doing a degree in acoustics. I totally wasn't. I was doing a degree in underwater science. Told them I was doing a degree in acoustics. Said, can I come and do work experience? Ended up doing like a whole season of work experience, all of the rubbish jobs, pulling all the heavy mains cables under the stages in the mud, looking after the VIP tent till 6 a.m., all the absolutely rubbish jobs. And then from there, I just ended up doing more and more rock and roll. Ended up mixing some really big bands, doing some big tours, do stadium stuff. And then I moved into theatre by very simple route. A friend of mine was mixing a West End musical called Blues Brothers, and he was asked, he was a rock and roller as well, and he was asked to go out and mix the Thunder tour. And so he said, do you want to cover me for 6 months? So I was a bit short of money at this point, because like a lot of people, I was drinking most of my wages at that point. So I bought a tent, and I lived in the band's garden of this West End show, Blues Brothers. The band let me live in their garden, and I mixed my first West End show as an A1, like just bang straight into it. Something unions would just would put an immediate stop to in the US, but I just went straight in as an A1. Absolutely loved it, loved the lifestyle, loved the thing, and never looked back.
Never went back to rock and roll?
There was a transitionary period. I went.
Yeah, I know you mixed it.
I still do the occasional festival. I mean, James Baker's on this call. He and I did a big rock festival in the UK not so very long ago, but it's a little bit of a busman's holiday. It's just go back and remind yourself, how real sound engineers earn a living.
Peter, I know for a fact that you were in the theatre sound world at ridiculously early age. The Mozart of theatre designers.
Yeah,
talk us through that one.
I mean, I sort of fell into it in ways, but I as a kid I was really interested in music and training on drums, not guitars. Even though I have some here, I need to brush up on those. But anyway, I was really into music and playing a lot of drums, and then I started dabbling in some sound, little 8-channel mixers and just tape decks, reel-to-reels, just fascinated by the technology of that. And there was a local theater in town that my parents had taken me to see some shows at, and the theater is close enough to New York that they had really great shows going on. They were bringing musicians in from New York and sound people in from New York, and I just happened to sit next to the sound console during a production, and I think I watched the sound desk and the sound operator more than I watched the show that night, and I was just fascinated, and I thought, this is something I'd love to do. And come to find out, one of my teachers when I was in the 4th grade was the house manager at the theater, and so we asked him if he'd be able to hook me up with an internship. And it didn't go well at first because the theater owner thought I was just too young to be there. But eventually they caved. I was about maybe 13 or 14 when I started there. And I was an intern for 2 weeks. And then I got hired as a full-time engineer after those 2 weeks of interning. But how I really got my foot in the door was the guy who was designing and mixing the sound at the summer theater that summer was a guy named Carmichael, and Graham was Martin Levin's first associate, and it just right time, right place, I think. And Graham taught me the ropes and how to mix, how to design. The rest is sort of history. I think even after I'd done it for a few years, I still didn't think that was going to be my job. I thought I would become an architect or something like that. Mm-hmm. And after about 5 years of doing it, I figured, collecting a paycheck, I think I'll keep doing this. I love it. It's a great time. It's exciting. So that was it.
Yes, it's interesting, right? So, like, Gareth, you've gone from, being a rock and roll guy, just covering for somebody, and now you got Gareth on sound. You got a whole team of people working for you. Just run it through for me and for the people who maybe are not so familiar with how a theatre sound team work. Just the kind of general roles, right? So you're the sound designer, and then you got your associates. Yeah, just talk me through how that all works.
Yeah, I guess it's a fair bit more autocratic than it is in rock and roll land. I mean, at least certainly the rock and roll stuff that I was doing years ago. You kind of I guess the major difference is that the person standing behind the mixing desk on a night-by-night basis isn't necessarily the person who's made the decisions as to how the show is going to sound. So the sound designer is overall responsible for everything that the audience hear, but those decisions are made in conjunction with other people. And so I have, on a show I'll have an associate, and to be honest, the associate is the clever guy. He's the one doing the legwork, really. The person who gets the network talking properly and gets all the computers behaving the way they're supposed to be and gets the right versions of the software and the right versions of the plugins, and reads all of the notes and all of the emails and knows what's happening, and they're kind of like, okay, so you need to check this, there's an email about this, you need to read this, you need to phone so and so. They're basically the people who kind of allow me to just concentrate on being creative. They're the people who worry about the nitty-gritty of just making it all work. And that associate is sort of integral, but they're still not the person mixing the show. The person mixing the show is called the A1, or the sound operator, or the sound engineer. And because we're mixing line by line, so let's say Pete and I are having a conversation and I'm saying like, great guitar, Pete, and he's like, yeah, don't open that window, you'll fall out, something like that. We'll be flipping the microphones on and off, on and off, on and off on a line by line basis. And that is a full-time job. Somebody standing there behind that mixing desk, mics on, mics on, mics off, all the way through the songs, all the way through the dialogue. For those of you who don't know, we do that to avoid phasing. We're using omnidirectional microphones up at the hairline, on the face. And if you have two people in even remotely close proximity and you've got two mics live, they'll just phase and comb and filter and it just sound horrible. So I think I'm going to go out on a limb, actually, Pete, and say Martin Levan was one of the people to pioneer that technique.
Yeah.
Amongst 1,000 other things, like putting microphones on people's heads and stuff like that. But I'm always a little bit unclear on the timeline. But
it's usually Martin or Andrew Bruce. It's the two of them were really working.
Right. And so these guys came up with the idea of line by line mixing. So the sound operator, the head of sound, is the person behind the desk doing all of that. And it's a full-time job. You're fully concentrating. You've got to watch what's going on stage. You've got to keep your eye on the script, cue list, sound effects queuing, presetting for things that are about to happen, line by line, all that. So as a result of that, it's quite difficult to just stop and go, you know what, I really want to adjust the snare, because you don't have enough hands, let alone enough brain space. So the sound designer is the person working on creating the show in conjunction with the sound operator, sort of like being in there and going, let's have a little bit more band, a little bit less vocals, that kind of stuff, and kind of getting a really good balance. It's a real team effort. Then you have production sound engineer, who's generally the person responsible for installing the system into the theatre, making the physical side of it, working with the associate to get it all working. And then you have the rest of the show running crew, which is like the A2, A3. They're the people backstage looking after radio mics, making sure the orchestra pit's working properly, just, comms headsets broken, fixing all that kind of stuff. So that gives you an idea of the sort of structure of the
okay, that's cool. So Peter, how as a start, what's the first creative meeting? I guess you get the call, are you interested, are you available, But then the thing that interests me is, where do you start with the concept? I
think every show has its own different inception period of ideas and meetings. It can start with a meeting with the director. It can start with a meeting with the music department. It might start, your ideas might start when you start reading the script. But I think every show is going to have an aha moment where you say, right, I think this is the direction. It's usually based on the material. If it's a musical, for me, it's going to be based on what style music is this show. And that's going to start to inform design decisions right from the beginning. The style and size of PA, the way that the band is going to be oriented in the pit, the type of microphones, all of that will reveal itself through the material, I think. But then if there are specialty things, when you're reading a basic script, it will be general. You're going to need a certain number of radio mics because you're looking at the cast list. You'll talk to the music department about the size of the orchestra and start to develop an input list for your orchestra. But then there's going to be shows where you have specialty items, whether it's, Gareth just did Back to the Future, and there's going to be a component of this that needs to be sound effects and something to do with the car, and you've got to build that in. When we did King Kong, it was the same thing. How do you deal with that? So you start to develop ideas, and for me, it also starts with what I call the worksheet, which is just an Excel worksheet. But I put a workbook together. It has tabs for all the different things, and I just start throwing ideas at it. And that's a document that I can share with the rest of the team. And generally, that's our jumping off point. We know roughly how many inputs, and we can take that and expand on that. We'll use that to throw loudspeakers in there, look at output structure, and And again, it starts to inform you as to the size and scale of the outputs of your system as well. And if you're using a scalable system, how many output cards you need. If you're using a non-scalable system, making sure you can fit within the parameters. Yeah, so that's it. The creative meetings are handy because you're going to get an idea straight off the bat from a director or a music team or a composer what style they want this show to be, and you make sure that you're in lockstep with them. If they say, you know, I want this show to really rock, then you know that you're going to need some horsepower. You're going to need to make sure that you have a good PA in there to deliver that. Sure. But if you're doing a show and they say, this has got to be natural sounding, this has got to be whatever their parameters are that they're describing, it allows you to know that you're in connection and in lockstep with what they really are looking for.
Right. So Gareth, the different departments, is it great communication between the different departments? Do you always know what everybody else is doing, or does that ever kind of break down? Or
you have to be really, really good at pretending you know what everyone else is doing. And that's where the associates really come into their own. They're really good at keeping an eye on this kind of stuff. I mean, there are certain departments where, like, you know, I've done shows with casting directors I've never met. Casting directors I've done 50 shows with, I've never met. We don't have any involvement in casting. But when it comes to scenic design, everyone wants it to look perfect. They don't want to see any speakers, but everyone wants it to sound perfect, which means the speakers have got to be in perfect positions. So that is always a big discussion. And I always find that getting in there as early as possible. I kind of have this thing where I kind of, before anyone's even seen the model box, anyone's even started doing drawings, I'm like, here's what sound design needs to be. Here's what speakers need to be. And then I can kind of go, well, you know, you did know that I had no speakers there. And, but it's like a constant discussion, constant debate to try and get the best results for everybody. And of course, everyone is aiming for the same thing, which is the best possible show. But yeah, certainly speaker positions versus, I don't want to say versus scenic, because that makes it sound like we're in competition with each other, but it can be a bit like that, trying to get the best possible positions without destroying the look of something. And then, of course, allowing space for automation, allowing space for lighting, video, all of this kind of stuff, making sure there's room for everybody to get everything else in. It's a big pre-production is a big thing, especially since there's no margin on these shows to load something into a theatre and go, well, that doesn't work. Let's take it all back down again, start again. You really do have to have, we do a lot of computer-aided design, a lot of meetings, drawings, trying to work stuff out, trying to preempt the problems before they happen. Because, take Broadway, for example, if you end up having to put in an extra 4-hour call because you messed something up, because lighting and sound didn't talk to each other about where a cross boom was going to go, that's going to cost somebody tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars. Yeah. And you just don't want to be that person.
Yeah, it's the same in my world nowadays. It's like you spend the first pre-production stuff arguing about, who's flying from where, and where there's, where the big telly's going rather than the speakers. I'm sure and your world is to the kind of the 10th degree, right?
I remember seeing Rocky, Pete, and thinking, where the hell is all this stuff coming from? I mean, how on earth? Where does it all keep coming from? I know the backstage at that theatre. I was just sitting there going, where is it? Like this? I mean, you must have spent months working out how to get everything into that space.
Yeah, I think the more intricate the shows, the more time we have to spend working it all out. But what's difficult is I find we're not always working in 3D. And nowadays, I think we're starting to get more into that. But it isn't that there's a set of drawings that everyone is working on and sending back and forth and putting their stuff into one master drawing, which is a bit of a problem. Everyone has their own set of drawings. So Scenic is working on their set. We're working on our set. Electrics is working on their set. Video is working on their set. But it doesn't always come together. And on Rocky, I think we actually did have someone that was taking all of our drawings and trying to put them together because of the intricacy of that. And we were, it's a game of real estate, really, and they're not making any more inside of that theater. So it was a game of inches the entire time. Every cable connector on the back of a loudspeaker had to be accounted for because the steel work was so intricate. But it's, a lot of it is keeping your eye on what's happening in the room, whether it's virtually on a piece of paper or once you step foot in the theater, just to take the first glance and look around the room. We're always looking, not because, as Gareth was saying, it's not us versus them. It's just everyone's trying to get it done. The plans for the theaters, they're so old at this point that they're not always accurate. So a couple inches could mean the difference between the loudspeakers fitting between the wall and the set and not. And so it's just always keeping your eye open, scanning the room, walking around, looking and seeing, identifying a problem as soon as possible, and then being able to politically address that and be able to get to the scenic designer and sit down and have a conversation. You know, he or she is going to want it to sound good as well. It's just, you know, you've got to come up with a compromise solution sometimes, and that's part of the gig.
Yeah. So
good point about the 3D. I mean, a lot of people are still not working in 3D, and the number of times that we've drawn, you know, before we started working in 3D, the number of times we've drawn a line array in plan and not taken into account the full depth of that, the depth of that banana. So you look at it in plan, you think, oh yeah, that should work, and you haven't quite taken, and you know, it then goes up and the whole thing is just smashed against the Brazilian wall. I mean, 3D, moving to 3D CAD has really helped us in that respect.
Yeah.
So I guess a part of your skill then is dealing with different people. So you got the producer, you got the director. Are they always in sync? Do they always want the same thing? Or you got the creative team?
Not always. Not always, I would say. I've definitely been in situations where the director and producer were actually at odds of what they wanted the show to sound like. And as a designer, you can get caught in the middle of that. And it's tricky. It's really tricky. And to the point of the extremities, you know, if somebody said, oh, I would love it to be a little more this or a little more that, but you can get into situations where a director wants a show loud and a producer wants to show natural. And you have to politically tread carefully. And a lot of times, you know, I always say with my team, we're managing expectations. So at a certain point, you have to say to them, let's sit down in a room and let's talk this out. And you both have to be able to decide what you want me to do. I can only do one of those two things. But I was in situations where, depending on who was in the room that night, we would try to change the sound because they still hadn't agreed, and you just didn't want to get yelled at the end of the night. But inevitably, there has to be a solution. There has to always be an outcome. So you sit down and you politically discuss it and come out with what the final answer is, and that's the direction we'll go.
Yeah, I guess. Sorry, Gareth, carry on.
I think I've been in more times than I can count the position where the director and the producers and the composer and the choreographers have different ideas as to what something should sound like, how loud it should be, how much bass there should be. I mean, a classic one is I worked on a musical. It had a lot of barbershop doo-wop style stuff in it, and of course the original style for that is really wet. I mean, absolutely dripping in reverb. And one of the producers was heavily involved in the original creation of this type of music. So he had a very clear idea of what it should sound like. But the director hates reverb. I mean, in his view, as soon as he hears reverb, he's out of the moment. This is no longer real. I've been detached from the show. It's horrible. So I'd have him going, the second he heard reverb, I'd have him actually screaming at me. And the second there was no reverb, I'd have the producer yelling at me. And we actually ended up having to build into every single song cue a start the song dry and then a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 second build up reverb cue that happened immediately after it. So you went into every song, it started dry. We didn't break that membrane moment between dialogue and song. And then gradually, the reverb would ramp up over the first few bars of the number, so that by the time the producer had got out of his seat and got to the mixing desk to go, there's not enough reverb to see it again. And we actually we put about another 60 cues in the desk, just doing reverb, just with reverb scopes, just doing the reverb returns, ramping up by like 10 seconds.
That's fabulous. So, you know, but in your world, there's, like in my world, it's simple. The boss is generally on stage, but in your world, the bosses Peter quite often stood behind you, right? Or the original creator of the music, for example.
They could be lurking anywhere. It's whoever the highest ranking officer is in the building at any given moment. You just have to, keep your eyes out for it. But, I think in general, if everyone has participated enough in the creative process, there will be discussion. But as long as everyone is in agreement, it's generally not too bad. You set about doing your thing. Every now and again, you get a situation like that. But yeah, you just don't know. And in the end, it's all just down to conversation. And if the composer is asking for something and the director comes up and said the exact opposite, you said, look, we had a note from the composer, and let's just sit down and talk this over, and we figure out which way. And there's great ways to debate all the creative. It's the same thing as the costume designers going through when someone says, I don't think those pants should be red, they should be blue. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about it. And if you want me to change them, I will. So
did you use a virtual sound check? You sit down with a virtual sound? I'm guessing you're not having these conversations when the cast are on stage, are you? Or maybe you are?
You could have a conversation anytime, sometimes in the middle of the show. Somebody pulls you into the lobby. but yeah, virtual sound check is a great tool, especially if there's something that we want to go back. And it's our only way to stop and rewind and evaluate. It's a great tool for working on mixes, because everything is live. You can't really stop and sort of deconstruct a mix in the moment. So the next day you can come in and you can put on some headphones and listen through and find a problem with the bass, whether it's a buzz, or adjust your plugins or whatever you want to do. But it's also useful for the operators to be able to work through a trouble moment if there's some finger choreography that they're trying to work through. But it also is a great tool when there are discussions about something that just isn't sounding right, and an ensemble moment where everyone's up there and they're dancing and they're singing, but we can't actually hear the ensemble, and you realize when you go back to the multi-track that you can only hear half of the ensemble singing or something. There's many things that can be revealed, and I think having that tool is really important these days, and has allowed us to take the sound of the shows to the next level. Whereas before you could only do what you could do in that 5 minutes of that number, and listening and moving faders as quickly as possible, but you didn't have the opportunity to say, right, all the faders down, let's rebuild this mix from the rhythm section back up again and start from scratch. So
yeah. Gareth, you do lots of different shows, lots of different styles of music. I've seen you mix lots of different styles of shows. Do you have a template that you work with, or do you do every show from scratch?
I when it comes to the front end of the system, so the processing side of it, I am pretty static in what I do. I kind of really have two system designs that I work with a lot at the moment. I always use D&B speakers. My logic for that is I like the way they're all voiced the same. So my logic is they're really good at constant directivity. So they're really good at going where you point them and not where you don't point them. But I also like the fact that there's a consistent voicing policy through the whole range, so that I know that if I put a vocal through a tiny speaker and a vocal through a really big speaker, I'm not going to have to fight to EQ the two different boxes to sound the same. I just need to fight with where they're located in the room and the room acoustics. So that's my reason for consistently staying with one brand. But I know a lot of people mix and match. I know Pete mix and matches. Most sound designers actually mix and match different speakers for different jobs on the same show. I don't, because of this voicing thing. I just figure my logic is it makes it easier. I'm obviously a big user of Avid desks. I pretty much at the moment only use Avid desks, but I have over the course of my career used Yamaha PM1D a lot, and Digico SD stuff I've used a lot. But these days I'm pretty much just with Avid, and I tend to stick with a kind of template because I don't have the brain space, I don't have the RAM, I don't have the random access memory to be able to go from system to system to system. And I know Pete uses loads of different consoles, and honestly, I'm envious of his ability to hold all of that information in his head. Where do I go when I want to change the group? Where do I go when I want to change the auxiliary? How does the automation work on this? For me, because I'm doing so many different shows, and quite often I'll be, slotting stuff in between, going from one, going to another, I really try to keep a sort of template of I kind of know where the kick drum is going to be, and I know what the layers are going to look like, and I know what plugins I'm going to use. And that doesn't mean that I don't evolve. But what it means is that if I come up with a good idea, I try to ripple that through every show. So if I want to change something, we're going to do that. Start doing that on every show, and it becomes a ripple thing. And I find that really helps not just me, but my associates, my production engineers, my other people working on my shows, that if a different associate has to remount a new show, they know, because they did that show, they kind of know how this show will work. And that's the way I tend to look at it from a front end point of view. But I have in the last couple of years really started experimenting with D&B's Soundscape system a lot. So I now kind of have sort of two basic system setups. I have a proscenium point source system, so like for and Juliet and Back to the Future, we were using the D&B KSL line array stuff, and it's a traditional proscenium PA system in the way you'd expect. But for Prince of Egypt and Diana and Come From Away in London, I hasten to add, we've been using D&B's Soundscape system. And actually, I know you mentioned Starlight Express the other day. When we did the complete refits for Bochum, the German production of Starlight Express, the money, that was our first outing on using Soundscape in that on that show. And so I kind of have these sort of two starting points, and then obviously I modify them. How many cast have we got? Who's in the orchestra pit? What strange things have we got going on? Back to the Future, we got a car flying around. Better get some speakers in that, that kind of stuff. But in direct contrast to the way Pete is going to answer this question, I have my fixed building blocks. I stick with them. They get modified over time. Things get added. Things get taken away. But I have a pretty specific template as to how I build shows.
Oh, yeah, sure, Pete. I think you got a slightly different approach. So yeah, tell us how you approach each different show.
I think fundamentally they are the same approach. It's just it manifests itself in a different way. So I'm looking at the jobs that each category of equipment has to do, and not necessarily changing because I'm looking for variety or changing because I'm looking for the next best thing, but really just trying to find the best tool for the job in that moment. And that could be dictated by the budget. It could, what's on the shelves at the shop. If we're being, our toes are held to the fire and we have to somehow reduce costs. But generally speaking, the function of the system remains the same. We know that we need the building blocks for each task are there. And then it's about scaling it to the production. There are definitely pieces of equipment that are in almost every show. And like Gareth, I have sort of two styles of designs. One of them is a larger, and if we're doing a big multi-channel, many outputs, big surround type of show, it'll usually be based around a Meyer Sound Dimitri system. If it's a smaller type of show, or even a lot of touring productions that we put out, it might be more of a Galaxy style, multiple galaxies strung together. Console-wise, the setups are very similar, whether I'm using an S6L or an SD product. The way that the desks are set up are functionally the same. You'll usually see on pretty much all of my shows, I've got Waves engines running plugins, and that's just for workflow. It isn't that I don't use the onboard effects or the onboard plugin capabilities in the S6L. It's usually just for workflow because I want to be able to access it from my production desk and not on the one screen on the console. So we have a big KVM head setup going on, and I can access any terminal from any terminal. I can access any computer in the system, which just allows me to work faster for the way that I work. So the console is going to be set up the same way. The inputs are going to be structured the same way, but it's usually following the same design guidelines. The way the bus structure is, the groupings on the desk I try to keep that always the same. We know what groups are there and how everything is getting submixed down in the desk.
Give us a little insight into that. So what would be a typical grouping then on a kind of rock type theater show?
Generally, I'm going to divide my radio mics up into leads and ensemble. And then I might, depending on the style of show, I might have different groups for different types of microphones. So if there are combinations of head mics and headsets, I'm going to have a different group because it's going to have a different compensation EQ or a different treatment on those. There's going to be clearly a band left, right, or an orchestra left, right, and there'll be reverb buses. And I'm just trying to look for groups of similar items, and that allows me to treat them similarly in the workflow. So I'm able to do compensation EQ. You can do quick sub mixes if you're doing utility mixes. I don't send, let's say you're sending vocals backstage to the dressing room towers. I'm not going to dial them in on an auxiliary on every channel. I'm going to send that from a group. So it just allows me to have bigger building blocks. It's quicker to work that way instead of dialing every single input on the desk to the backstage system, or you know, to certain other utility areas.
So am I right in thinking, tell me if I'm wrong, guys, but I get the feeling that, Gareth, you're working more within the console, and Peter, you're working more external to the console. So you're working with your Dimitri and the Waves plugins and all of that stuff. Would that be fair to assess, man?
I think so. You know, I tend to have groups leaving a desk in a general sense. Again, it may change based on the show, but in a large scale musical, I will tend to have groups leaving the desk and going into something like a Dimitri system where I can then do other things with it. But that might be different for Gareth.
Yeah, Gareth. So I've seen you're on kind of remote control on the desk if you're not on the desk itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, from an output structure point of view, it depends on it's one of the two systems that I'm currently working with. If it's DS100, pretty much everything is leaving soundscape-wise. Everything's pretty much leaving either direct out of the console, or, you know, small bus things like, you know, 2 snare mics bus together, that kind of stuff. Yeah. But if it's my standard proscenium design, I've always tried to keep it as simple as I can. So I generally use the matrix in the console, and then I don't even generally go through processing. So I know, like, rock and roll guys, they're really into lake processing and that kind of stuff. And a lot of people use Galileo and Galaxy and that kind of thing. I just go straight to the D&B amplifiers and then build a massive R1 rope template to control it all. So my input structure is super simple. I'm kind of like microphones to stage crate to desk back to a stage crate, and then straight into the amplifiers, kind of keeping it really short, really simple, and kind of making sure that there's the smallest number of places that I can trip myself up. Because the number of times that I've kind of got confused with, why does that sound like that? And completely forgetting that I'd made some adjustment somewhere else. Yeah. So I tend to try and keep it as simple as I can in that respect.
So actually, that's something that interests me a lot, because it's something that all of us have in common is voicing the speakers, tuning the PA system, right? In my world, it tends to be simpler. There's fewer zones. In your world, there's more zones. Just run me through that, Peter. You know, do you start with Smart? Do you facetiously? I generally ask people, do you use Steely Dan or Talk or whatever the current kind of CD du jour is? Or
yeah, I mean that's how I was weaned. Was you take your Gaucho CD and you put it in the CD player and you have at it. But these days, I am using Smart, but it is definitely, it's a tool. And I know everyone says this, that whenever you start talking about Sim or Smart, people say, well, how do you use it and how does it work? And it's a tool. In the end, it comes down to your ears. And I'll use Smart to align things, clearly looking for problems, looking for issues with a loudspeaker, polarity, whatever it happens to be. But it only gets you so far. And in the end, you work on a zone, you turn the pink noise off, you turn on your music and you listen. And the music can be, for me, it can be anything that I have some familiarity with. I definitely have discs that I use quite often because I've become accustomed to them. I've retired my Steely Dan Gaucho, but it can be anything. And there are times where I'll even put on music that I don't really even know just to get a feel for it. But if I am working on something specific, I will probably say, I don't know this album or this song well enough to really adjudicate this problem. Let me put something on that I know, because I've heard it on so many different systems. And I think it's the same thing for Gareth or for you. You could put on a disc that you know, or I mean, nowadays we don't use CDs, but
Yeah.
put on a tune that you know, and pretty quickly be able to assess what's happening in your system and whether it's in the ballpark or not. So it is a combination, for me, it's a combination of smart and using my ears, and it's zone by zone. You got to work there's so many zones in a musical theater system. You have to start in one place and build out. You can't really scattershot it. At least I can't. My brain doesn't work that way. I have to build from one area and then I add to that, because you are trying to work from the stage out.
So you work from the main PA system outwards. You're happy with that, and then so time alignment is something we were all talking about this earlier, right? So time alignment is such a subjective thing. The hardest thing for every sound engineer in the world is how sound travels so slowly, right? So how I guess is that experience? How do you work with that?
Gareth, you want to take that one?
Yeah, Gareth, jump onto that one. How do you find that? You know, how do you the software takes you so far, but then you've just got to kind of open your ears and listen, right?
Well, I mean, I know it's kind of sacrilege to say, but I actually don't use Smart. I tune, if it's the proscenium, if it's the Gareth proscenium system, I pretty much all by ear. And I have a big advantage in that a lot of my associates, we've been working together for so long, and we've all kind of grown up together, and we all kind of know what it is we're trying to achieve. So these guys and girls can get a very similar result just by using ear. And we have Gareth's Soundcheck CD, and it is 16 tracks, all of which we at this point in our lives hate beyond measure. But we all know, for example, that if we use Toto Slipped Away, the difference between the way it goes snare, kick, 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 snare, you can take what you're feeling coming at you from the subs and what you're hearing hitting the snare and the top end of the kick, and you can get sub-alignment going on like that. When we started working with DS100 stuff, we realized that there is stuff going on inside the Soundscape DS100 that is not quantifiable. It doesn't show up as any display anywhere. So we ended up having to start using more analysis stuff to get to grips with what Soundscape was actually doing inside this magic black box. And the software that we found that seems to deliver the best measurement of impulse is a antiquated old bit of software called Tuning Capture. And it does really, really, really good analysis of chirp analysis of timing. And so we've been using that quite a lot, but still I don't do any pink noise analysis, any of that kind of stuff. But coming back to what you were actually asking about time alignment, I mean, people get so hung up on time alignment, but at the end of the day, you move 2 seats to the left and it's all gone to pot anyway. So it's everything is a compromise. We're not sitting in a sweet spot in the middle of a recording studio. Everything is a compromise, and just trying to achieve the best possible compromise. Pete said earlier about managing expectations and managing compromise. Tuning a sound system is compromise. You get the perfect time alignment between 4 speakers in 1 seat. You move 2 seats to the left and it's completely gone. So that, it is just managing compromises. It's achieving the best result you can within the parameters.
Yeah. So Pete, does that
in a musical theater system, or in most theater systems, because of the number of zones, you put 2 speakers in a room and you've already compromised. There's going to be combing, there's going to be cancellation and summation, but it really just comes down to feel and starting to get an idea of what you're after and listening, just using your ears. But yeah, it's the concept of time alignment. If you're getting into the physicality of how it all works, everyone thinks, well, I used Smart and I time aligned and this is what it said. Well, it's only time aligning at 1 frequency, and depending on the size of the loudspeaker, you're
and where you place the microphone as well, right? Where you place it's time aligned.
So where your mid range sits in the time alignment realm versus your HF. And I'm sure, look, I'm not a physicist. I'm sure somebody who designs loudspeakers is going to be able to debunk all these things. But when I listen to a system, there are times where after I've gone through and touched it with smart just to get it in the ballpark, everything gets moved. Everything gets moved by ear at the end, and I'll adjust time and I'll adjust EQ. But as I have a starting spot, and then I'll say the voice, it's not locked to me. And I go and I shift it a little bit and I say, that's how I want it to sound. And that might be because I'm now timelining more of the mid-range of the voice instead of the 10K realm where the delay finder is working. But it really is just how you want it to sound. And when you sit there and listen in a seat, does it sound the way you want? And in some ways, it connects back to that question of how do you start designing a system for a show? And there are times where I just sort of imagine sitting in an empty theater and thinking, what is this show going to sound like? And how can I build a sound system and build sound effects or amplify an orchestra or a vocal to give me that visceral connection with what's happening up there? And just sort of close your eyes and where is the sound coming from? And do I have enough PA in those areas to do those things?
I spend quite a lot of time thinking about consistency as well. I mean, what I'm really hoping for is that if the composer comes up to me at intermission and says, I really think the bass guitar sounds strange, I really want to know that where he or she is sitting down there, 10 rows, four seats off to the right, I really want to know, okay, what she's hearing is what I heard.
Yeah.
Do I understand what she's talking about? What I really don't want to be in a position of is kind of going, well, she could have heard something completely different to what I heard in terms of bass. So consistency and trying to get the same thing around the room. That way, when somebody comes to you and says, I think it's too loud, you kind of go, well, it should be basically the same where I am as where he was. Is it too loud or is it not too loud?
Has that changed? I mean, I don't know about you, but the more I go to the movies these days, it seems to be louder than ever. Did that happen in the theatre world? Did shows get louder?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
And is that because the music that was in these shows changed, or is that because the audience expectations changed, or
both? I think. I think it's everyone. The level in which you listen to something is so individual. My wife listens to the television at a different level than I listen to the television. And when you sit down and put your headphones on, everyone's going to reach for that dial and turn it to a different position.
Yeah.
And when you're sharing an experience in a room with 1,000 or 2,000 people, there's bound to be differing opinions. So it really does come down to, the opinions of the people that are paying you versus, but you're trying to average it out and trying to make sure that everyone is getting the best experience possible, and that the most people are enjoying the level at which the show. But, I think people are listening louder these days with all their personal devices, and certainly in albums, the loudness war was a thing, and people trying to master their songs louder so it had better translation on the radio. And, that's the world in which we live in. But definitely, even when we were doing rock and roll shows years ago, I think those shows sounded different than our rock and roll shows now.
But that's the beauty of our job, right? Whether it's a theatre or a rock and roll show. I talk to friends who are record producers, and they spend 6 months making a record, and then they put that record out into the world, and people listen to it just on their phone, just the speaker of their phone, dodgy headphones. You have no control over the timbre, you have no control over the volume. But in a live sound situation, whether it's a theatre show or a rock and roll concert, it's one of the things that we get to control, Gareth, right? We're control freaks. We get to go, this is how loud it's going to be. This is how much you're going to feel the kick drum when it comes in. That's one of the, I think, the joys for me of mixing live.
I also think audiences' expectations have changed. When I first started working in theatre, there was very much this idea that every microphone was hidden, that every speaker was hidden, that the sound of the orchestra came out of the orchestra pit, the sound of the performers came from the voices, from the people on stage. And it was opera to some degree. It's still quite a lot like that. Everything was about hiding the sound system. Everything was about hiding the existence of a sound system at all, which was wonderfully ironic when you consider half of the back of the auditorium was taken out by these massive Cadillac mixing desks. But it was all about pretending that we weren't amplifying. And now you go to the movies and you're hit with a Dolby Atmos, timpanis, shaking the floor, spaceships flying over the top, people get in their cars, and even your basic Ford Taurus has 18 different speakers. Everyone's got music players. You can buy a full surround system for your front room television for $190 from Target. It's what people expect to hear has changed, but yet for so long we've still been apologizing for sound in theatre. And what I think Peter and I have both done is kind of embrace the cinematic nature of theatre sound. That's not to say we don't do quiet and visible shows. I did 42nd Street at Drury Lane, everything about it was pretending that we weren't there. But most of what I do these days is cinematic. It's not apologizing for the sound. It's, if it's appropriate, the timpani is going to hit you in the chest. If it's appropriate, the sound effects are going to zoom over your head, just like they would in a movie theatre. And I think people's expectations have changed. And that's good, because that's exciting. It's exciting for me, at least, as a sound engineer, getting to do stuff.
And Pete, I guess part of that is loads of the shows that you guys are working on have come from movies in the first place. So that changes the expectation, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I think the connection between shows that are coming from the screen to the stage, or shows that are written because in the author's mind they are still based on a cinematic experience, and you can pick up a script and immediately know that it was written with almost a TV production idea in mind of how quick they cut between scenes, the way that the music is structured versus a traditional musical theater show, which is structured in a completely different way. But as soon as you are looking at these screen to stage adaptations, it is saying something immediately about your design sound-wise and what you can get away with, but also what they're expecting. You're not going to do Back to the Future and not have amazing sound effects and cars, and the car's got to be a character, and same thing with King Kong. It just doesn't work if King Kong comes out on stage and is 30 feet tall and he sounds natural and small on stage. He's got to shake your trousers a bit, otherwise I think you're not doing it right. But it's all subjective. Somebody might disagree with that.
The sound of King Kong, right, I have to say, he was pretty awesome. It's got trouser shaking.
But that's the fun of it, like Gareth is saying. Like that's the kind of thing, those are the kind of challenges that you go to bed at night thinking about and wake up in the morning ready to take action and figure out how to do it and how to make it exciting and interesting. But I don't think it necessarily translates into making it louder. That is generally our job. People don't call us and say, can you come in and take sound away from this theater? Generally, we're being asked to add more. It's just how much. And I just think as someone, as Gareth said, we've grown up doing this for a long time, and we've seen the craft evolve. When I started, everything was hidden and everything was very small, for better or worse. And I think there were great natural sounding shows. And we still do great natural sounding shows today. But I find there are a lot of times where I will start a show and set up a system and get into cast rehearsals and maybe even do the first run through, and I'll think it's appropriately done. And someone will come and say, it's just not loud enough. It just needs to be louder. And I say, like a little bit? No, like a lot louder. And I think, wow, this is completely out of scale where I thought this style of a show, which might not be a traditional book musical, but there are book musicals as well that I'll put together and think, this is the opportunity to show restraint, and it's natural and amazing. And you start it off, and the first thing is the producer comes and said, just turn it up. Turn it all up. And you think, okay, well, then let's. So.
There is this fear. There is this thing that producers and directors this pit they can sometimes fall into, which is if something isn't quite working, you make it faster and louder. And it's really, really easy to just come to a sound designer and go, I just think this number needs to be louder. And you kind of sitting there thinking, it'll still be shit. It will just be louder.
Yeah.
But make it louder if you want. And we do quite often get asked to try and help things be better. And the layman's solution to that is often just make it louder.
Yeah, been there, done that. I remember the first show I did for radio. There's 80,000 people in a football stadium in Chile, in South America, and the song starts off with like a little backwards sample of a bell, you know, the first song to 80,000 people screaming in this, and you know, the temptation is to kind of push it up and try and make it louder, but actually you got to be brave enough to keep it quiet and make the audience quiet down and you know, feel that moment, so that when it does get loud, there's a dynamic, right? That's the interesting
and that's sort of the trick. I'm Gareth, maybe you have something to speak of as well, but I find the trick to these big cinematic musicals is dynamics. You gotta, for every time you go big, you gotta get small again, and you have to be able to really take the audience on a ride. I get fatigue if I just listen to a show that is at me the entire night, but if you shape it and craft it, you can take people on a journey, and it really becomes exciting. And when you, what you quickly learn is, when you come from something small and hit with something big, the gap between those doesn't even have to be as big as you think to make something feel loud, and vice versa. If you're coming from something huge and you pull back, it's dramatic. And it really, I think it's musical in its very nature to be able to do something like that. And it takes the audience and grips them and brings them with you on that journey.
Even in the loudest rock and roll musicals, you kind of want that moment where the audience is actually having to lean forward just a little bit, because you know, you've got everything right, and everyone has to go really quiet, kind of like almost lean into the stage, and you kind of, you know, maybe they're not actually quite leaning into the stage, but you kind of get the gist, and you can get that, and then when you come up again, it's like, oh, you know, it can really excite. I mean, it's fabulous when you get that right. Absolutely fabulous.
And is that, do you talk about that with the director or the musical director? Like the curve of a show is something I'll talk about a lot. The curve of the dynamic of a show. You know, it peaks, it drops, it peaks, until you have your I guess in your case, the kind of big showstopper song, right?
Yeah.
It's like everything that we're doing. It's a team effort with the other creatives to get that shape. But it really helps if you're all on the same page and all trying to achieve the same thing.
I've just thought of something. I haven't had one single question from the audience because I've been absolutely absorbed with what you two guys have been saying. Chris Lambrex, my dear friend and colleague, Q&A. You got some questions from the audience for?
Yeah, there's quite a few. We can cover some now, which relate back to the earlier parts. I'm just going to read these out, right? There's one for Gareth, one for Peter specifically. So I'll start with the one that came in first. That was for Gareth. You started in rock and then transitioned into theater. And the person asking this question is actually in the opposite boat. So he's saying, I'm studying theater sound design and I want to end up in rock. Do you have any advice or any similarities or differences between the two worlds?
Good question.
I think the biggest difference between rock and roll and theatre is where your client is located. So in rock and roll land, your client is on the stage most of the time, and in theatre land, the person who can sack you is generally out in the audience. And that can get confusing quite quickly. I remember when I tried to put Perspex screening around Charlie Watts for Rolling Stones, and Ronnie Wood just walked on stage and just went, this isn't very rock and roll. And I started to argue about it, and then I was like, no, it's not going to work like this. This is just going to have to go, because he's the boss. There's no point me arguing about it. Whereas in theatre, if the people in the orchestra pit, we're on the same level, so I can go. So they can't just immediately say, I'm not doing this. You can have a conversation about it. Everyone's kind of on the same level. That wasn't really answering the question, though. Was the question, how do you move from theatre to rock and roll?
Yes, I think that's what he was asking about, yeah.
I haven't tried it, but the skill set of learning how to get on with people, being somebody that people want to be in the same room with, I mean, that's all cross-platform compatible, if you will. I would have thought you'd be quite well positioned to make that transition. As to how to actually specifically do it, I don't have a great insight on that, I'm afraid.
Get used to a smaller amount of income, I suppose that'd be one of the main things you'd have to do, right?
Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
What was the question for Peter, Chris?
Yes, so I'm going to read this one out as well. When watching a short video about the sound in Beetlejuice, I was intrigued by the fact that there was a dedicated sound effect operator due to the extremely high number of sound effects. How is a show that is so dependent on sound effects mixed in comparison to other productions?
Great.
That's actually a really good question. You know, yesterday when we were doing our prep talk here between the four of us, Gareth and I were talking about how when we started, there didn't seem to be a lot of sound effects in musical theater. It was always the same effects used all the time. You had a dog bark, a thunderclap, you know, a phone ring. It was, yeah, you could have it on one CD and have the greatest hits. I think as the shows have become more cinematic, there is more weight put on the amount of sound effects in a show. And by the time, I think maybe Rocky, I might be misremembering, but Rocky may have been the first show that I had so many sound effects on the show that we needed a dedicated sound effects operator. But Rocky, King Kong, and Beetlejuice all ended up with dedicated sound effects operators. Mostly because in the musical theater realm, there's one operator generally out front, and that person is responsible for everything that happens on that desk. So they're taking cues, mixing line by line, and at a certain point, there's just too many cues to be able to concentrate on what the show is sounding like. And also the triggering of the sound effects can be really specific, whether it's a visual cue that you're watching something on stage. You know, in Beetlejuice, there are effects that are triggered based on actions that are happening on stage, and you really have to be focused. And Callan, who was running the sound effects in the show, they were in tune with the actors. They knew exactly where an arm was going to be at any given moment. And Dave Horowitz, who was mixing the show, he was able to just concentrate on what is the show sounding like and making sure the balance between those microphones is impeccable. And that's the sort of teamwork, because as soon as you're putting your brain power into watching the stage and hitting that button when the arm movement happens or the cue light goes off, you've now lost perspective of what the blend is. So it really came from that. And it's a difficult thing to achieve as well, because you're adding crew members to an already tightly run ship. So it really was a long conversation. But Rocky was done with the same director as Beetlejuice, and Alex Timbers is great because he hears so much, but he is really in tune with the sound effects. And he wants, you know, in Rocky we had light switches. You know, when a character walked into a room and turned the light on or off, he wanted a light switch sound effect, even just in the very background, because he thought it sounded unrealistic to not hear anything and just have the lights come on or turn off. So all of those things were all tied in, and we realized quickly we needed somebody to really be minding the shop. And so
Did you create the effects from scratch? How does that work?
Yeah. I mean, all of the effects for all of those shows are a combination of library and live recorded. Usually it's more heavily library and not as much live recorded, but certainly, you know, for all three shows, there were definitely live recordings done. And I work in Pro Tools. I create all my effects in Pro Tools, and then they get deconstructed to figure out how to trigger them lives, and then put into QLab and triggered from there.
Hey, Gareth, so Back to the Future, that must have been tricky. All those kind of different car sounds, having to trigger them live. Talk me through that process. How does that work?
Well, one of the benefits was that we got the Pro Tools session, we got a bounce of the Pro Tools session of the movie with all the sound effects stemmed out, which was absolutely fascinating.
That's cool.
So we had all of that as a reference, and the way I went into it was I thought, well, we'll use all of the existing sound effects from the movie as a guide, but we'll try to modernize them. So what would they have done if they had the resources that we have today to recreate these sound effects? Which, interestingly, actually, on a small tangent, is how I quite often approach jukebox musicals. I quite often approach them on the basis of, say, for example, I'm doing this new Michael Jackson musical on Broadway, and my approach for it is what would the performer or Michael Jackson do if they were in the studio today with all of the same resources, with all the same ideas and the same plan and the same song, but with the benefit of today's plugins, today's processing, today's surround sound, Dolby Atmos, etc., etc. And so I kind of take that viewpoint with sound effects as well, in that even if there are, because we do a lot of this stuff where there's previous reference material, but I try to take that and modernize it without losing what it would have been. But then we also have to think about sound effects in a very different way to the way movie people do. So Pete and I were talking about this yesterday, about how in a movie you've got your section of video that's fixed. You then sit down, you do the sound effects for it, you rewind, you do it again, you rewind, get it right, and then that's fixed, it's done, never changes, you move on to the next bit. Whereas, for example, in Back to the Future, Marty gets into the DeLorean, he presses a button, that's a visual cue, then he starts the car, that's another cue. Then he puts on his seatbelt, so the car has started, vroom, vroom, and then it's idling, and then he puts on his seatbelt. And before he can put his foot on the accelerator and the car drives off, he's got to be safe because that car's going to do crazy things and he needs to be wearing a seatbelt. So there's an amount of time. It should take him 3 seconds to put on the seatbelt and everything out, but sometimes it might not. So I can't just do 3 seconds of idling and then straight into the rev and off we go. I've got to have an indeterminate amount of car idling, maybe some bleeping and blooping and swishy plutonium chamber stuff going on to fill that gap until Marty puts his foot on the accelerator and the car takes off. So we have to build things in sections that all link together and can loop and vamp and stay joined for, say, the emergency where he gets in the car and he can't get his seatbelt on. And he spends 15 seconds getting his seatbelt on. The last thing you want is suddenly the car just... wow, this is
supple stops, yeah.
And we've all been there. We've all been there when something...
Yes.
10 seconds will be absolutely fine. 45 seconds later, you're just sitting there with your head in your hands. Everybody's looking at you. We've all been there. Yeah, we have to think about how to construct these things in a totally different way to movie and TV, guys.
Yeah.
So
in that sense, the car is a character, and it's the same. I think movie to screen. Movie to stage adaptations. It was the same thing for King Kong. All of a sudden, you're thinking of it differently. It can't be it isn't a sound effect. It's a collection of sound effects that give life to this iconic piece. And the same thing happened on Kong, where it was trial and error, figuring out how do you develop this character's voice, whether it's a car or a beast. And it became a live element. So everything, the voice of Kong in the show was all live. And I would sit there and watch all the different versions of the movies of King Kong and try to figure out what it was supposed to be and how you would trigger effects. And I had worked with the same company that did King Kong years ago. We did a show called Walking with Dinosaurs. And it was more of a parade of dinosaurs. And they would walk around the arena and they all had sounds. And it was all done with samples. And you'd create voices for each of the creatures, and it was played off of sampler, but the puppeteers that were puppeteering the characters had a little keyboard and they could play certain sounds to go along with certain actions on the stage, but it was very limited, and the characters would parade around and you might have a couple roars and a couple things, and most characters didn't have much interaction, so it was finite. Fast forward, we did a couple more shows with the same company and developed the technology a little more. But by the time we got to King Kong, it just didn't work. You couldn't really sit there and say, well, how would we play the scene? Well, we push this button for this sniff and then this roar. And it just never felt real. And in the end, it came down to, let's do it live. We have to create an engine that will allow us to do everything this character can do in the most live sense when the beast is interacting with a human on stage, that they are never going to do it the same every night either. So how do we come up with the best of both worlds?
So was there an actor doing the voice of Kong then?
Yeah. It was there were a couple puppeteers. They call them voodoo operators. That's the terminology for them for this particular company. Yeah. And there was a booth that we built up in the back of the balcony. And they have wireless control of all of the animatronics in the beast. And one of the voodoo operators had a microphone, SM58, and the SM58 fed down, and it was actually a Pro Tools system running with no transport. It just parked playhead. We moved the playhead because then we could have different presets, and there were pedals and triggers that could modify presets, but it was all done live. And we had voice training sessions with him where I'd sit and we'd talk about how you could get results out of the system. And you know, imagine on your H3000 where you go to the pitch shift type of thing,
Yeah.
and talking to your mic and everyone has a great time. It was like that, but on steroids. There were pitch shift elements, there were parallel chains, there was, you know, all sorts of stuff in there, all born of how do we magnify everything that you could do into that microphone, and whether it was a sniff or a growl or a grunt or a roar, and there were samples integrated. I mean, it was so much fun to create, but there were moments of doubts. There were definitely, you know, getting into it where you think this is not going to work and it's not going to be great at all. And then there was definitely a moment of breakthrough where it started to take shape into something. And the first time we turned on the voice system into the big PA and thought, okay, we're on to something now. This could be pretty cool. So yeah, it was all live.
Amazing.
Similar with the car for Back to the Future, where I was trying to make it all line up with played back, recorded samples of cars revving and brakes and all this, and I just wasn't getting anywhere with it. And then I was talking to the video designer. This is all in pre-production. I was talking to the video designer who you also did Frozen with, Pete, and a guy called Finn Ross, and he was saying to me that he live animates all of the video, like live during the show. He's not just playing back video clips. It's all engines live animating. And I sort of got to thinking, well, maybe I could do the same with the car. So I started investigating computer game granular synthesis. And of course, there's a lot of computer games based around cars. So there's an awful lot of granular synthesis car sound effects engines out there. So we basically got hold of one, and we started we worked out how to control change it with OSC and MIDI, and kind of took control of this car engine and used that so that we could actually just sit there and live to get a little bit more brakes, a little bit more rev, let's build the speed up, more exhaust, less exhaust, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, it was a real departure from my traditional way of doing sound effects, which is I need a car rev, okay, type car rev into sound effects library, find car rev, like that one, play that, modify it, maybe pitch shift it, maybe make it go slower, maybe go faster, but basically linear playback. And much in the same way that Pete did Kong's voice live, it was a real departure. Like I'm really excited. I'm going to do way more of this kind of stuff.
Amazing. I was thinking about this jukebox musicals as well, right? Because you touched on Michael Jackson, but the Motown one, right? I was thinking about you in the Motown one, Pete. You got absolute legends there who just created this whole kind of genre of music. Were they kind of giving you little tips on creating the sounds?
Yeah, it's for a show like that was covering so many generations of different styles of music as well. It was a little daunting, but we definitely listened to the entire catalog over and over and over again, and really tried to get a feel and tried to evolve the sound from the early days of Motown all the way through to the more modern sound that Motown, after it moved to LA and they started using modern techniques. Exactly the same as what Gareth was saying is, all the albums of yesteryear were born out of what they had available to them. And it was a nerve-wracking experience to sort of bring the faders up and have Berry Gordy, who founded Motown, there. He was with us all the time, and to have him listening and to think this guy was in those studios listening to all this music being made, how are we ever going to live up to that? But the one thing I do remember is he was so kind to us the entire process, and we were doing a preview performance, and we went for notes with BG. Everybody calls him BG, and we thought, okay, let's see how this goes. And he loved the sound of the show, and he said, but dancing in the street, there's this one thing that is just not right, and it's never going to really jump off the page if we don't get it right. And it was the backbeat. And he said, when we did this in the studio, it was a hand clap and a slapstick and a thing, and we worked on that for days and days and days. And BG would come back and say, no, it's still not right. And we had slapsticks and things and snare drum doubles, and it just, finally we got it. And he came up and said, oh, that's it, man, that's it. And it was really just, again, it's all about the feel. It wasn't that if you do X, Y, and Z, you get the sound of the backbeat and dancing in the street. it was all about the feel, and he wanted that same feeling in the theater that was present the day they recorded that in the studio, and said, that's it, that's the sound, that's how this song is going to make people get up and dance. And that's a good lesson that I always take with me as well. It's all about the feel. If it makes people tap their toes and have a good time, then you're doing something right.
It's a great story. You had something similar about Out of Hell, right? Didn't you, Gareth? Didn't you?
I wasn't going to mention that it was Bat Out of Hell, so you kind of...
Did I blow it? Okay, sorry, dude.
Thank you. There was a large rock and roll musical that was not Bat Out of Hell, for anyone who's got anything to do with Bat Out of Hell watching this video.
It was Rat Out of Hell. It was a Rat Out of Hell, though.
I just don't know if I'm a shot for telling this story. Now you've told them what the show is. There was a large rock and roll musical that was not Bat Out of Hell, where the composer could not be in the space with us. But every day we were beaming him the sound mix live from the theatre, and beaming him the sound mix live from the theatre and videos, and he was giving the director notes. He was giving sound department notes. He was giving everyone notes, and it got to the point where the
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have put you in that position. I do apologise.
There was a decision made to put another mixing desk between the live sound mixing desk and the broadcast mix that was going to the composer, and applying some of his notes to the secondary mixer.
I'd forgotten for that story lead up. I wouldn't have asked a question otherwise.
Another one as a little tangent, because this is a much more pleasant story. When we're getting ready to do Michael Jackson, which of course we're supposed to be doing now, we're totally not, because we're all furlonged and stuck. But we were allowed to go into Sony's studios and dig into the Michael Jackson multi-track recording. And we got to sit there with some of the original recording engineers and talk to them about how they did stuff. And they were like, and we were getting to solo, like the effects tracks and stuff. And the guy's sitting there and he's saying, yeah, so at one point we decided we wanted to make it right. Listen to this bit. See how that delay gets longer? That is the studio assistant dragging the tape machine further down the room, so that the piece of tape between the two tape machines, the two tape heads get further away. It's like, listen to this scream. That scream is recorded in the stairwell outside this door. Go down there, look around the door. Down there, we put a microphone at the top. Michael Jackson went to the bottom, screamed, we recorded it. I mean, and finding things in these recordings, like synth parts, that suddenly, when you listen to them, you discover they're not synth parts. They're Michael Jackson going, ooh, 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 ooh. It was mind-blowing. Mind-blowing. Much better story than the Bat Out of Hell story.
It's like sound archaeology, right? It's like you dig it. It's like you dig into. You're like the Indiana Jones of sound effects there.
Absolutely fascinating. One of the most incredible 48 hours we ever spent, just digging into these recordings and discovering this incredible stuff. It was amazing.
I love that. That's amazing. Hey, unbelievably, we're running out of time, and typically we've covered about 1/3 of the things that I wanted to touch on. So, any more questions from the house, Chris, before I kind of close things down?
Yes, loads. And well, actually hoping as well that throughout the conversation, some of these have been answered. I'll just randomly pick some. So for both of you, actually, do you ask your operators to mix in a certain way, or leave it totally up to their preference?
Just Peter, you start with that one.
I guess it's a tricky way to answer, but certainly there are instincts that an operator has, and so I will always start by allowing we talk about what the show is. We talk about what the show wants to sound like. But inevitably, there's got to be a starting place for discussion. So the operator is going to get behind the faders and start to do their thing. And there's going to be discussion to say, hey, why don't we try this? Why don't we do this? But it is a team, and nothing that I do can make the show sound good if the operator isn't also feeling it. So it's a really good team effort. But the instincts of the operator, whether it's the way the system is hitting them or the way that they're feeling the show, it is in their control. Once that opening night performance starts, you walk away and they are in control of it. But it is a team. And so certainly, I find it difficult to say to an operator, we want to do this completely different. And if you're feeling it differently, you're going to have to change the way you're feeling it. That's tricky. But sometimes you get into that situation. But moreover, the operator is going to get in the ballpark, and you're going to be able to say, all right, let's work on this together, and we're going to hone it. And there are times where the operator is going to find things that you didn't even see. And so it's a good team effort.
Gareth, are you on that? You're kind of the boss, aren't you? Aren't you? You would let.
Nothing to add to that, except for the fact that a good operator, you can't teach that last bit of instincts. I always kind of feel like there are sound operators that are only ever going to be 90%, because there's something about that last 10% that is pure instinct that you just can't teach. And yeah, I mean, it was depending on how detailed the mix is and how many directional notes we're getting from other creatives depends on how much I have to get involved with the sound operator. But it's a total team effort, and if that person behind the desk isn't doing the job, it's just a miserable experience. Not least of which because you're spending all your time worrying about what they're doing and not worrying about what you're supposed to be doing. So the show doesn't end up as nuanced or as detailed as it should be, because you're just worrying about the band's too loud, pull the VCA down. And so it's really, those people behind the desk, they're really, really important.
But the benefit that we have, as a sound designer, is that we are not hands-on faders at that moment usually. So we have all our brain power to be listening and observing. And an operator might be in the middle of trying to mix a really complicated scene and taking cues, and we can be a great resource to say, hang on a minute, I have a great idea. I'm seeing that you're getting hung up here because this cue is in the middle of that fast sequence. What if we shift it so we move the cue? Or, there are things that we can hear and then advise. The buck ultimately stops with us. We're the ones that are going to get yelled at if something isn't sounding right. But it is absolutely a team effort, and it's all of us together sitting down and saying, all right, how do we look at this song as a chunk and make this sound as good as it can, as a group.
Yeah, that's interesting, that thing about sitting and listening objectively. Something I asked you guys earlier is, when you go to watch a musical because your wife or your kids want to see a musical, can you leave that critical listening behind, Gareth?
If it's a good sound design, I can forget the sound design and enjoy the show. If it's a bad sound design, it'll ruin the show for me. And there's lots of good sound designers out there, and there's lots of good sound designers out there. And there are people that I love to go and watch their shows just to listen to the sound design. There are other people that I actually don't go to see their shows because I know I won't enjoy it. But for the most part, the art of sound design at the sort of Broadway Western level, across the board, to be quite honest, it's about enjoying it for what it is.
Yeah,
it's not a great answer. Sorry.
No, it is a good answer. Actually, I struggle with the same thing. I'm scared when I go and see a band I love that the sound won't be good because that will spoil the experience for me, and I can't turn off that critical listening. So we're just about out of time. I've got two more questions for you. Pete, I'm going to ask you, this one is maybe is a little bit of a cliche, but I'm sure there's a lot of aspiring sound designers out there in the world. I think there's two different paths, and I'm going to ask you about the US path, Pete. What's the path to move up through the ranks and one of these days end up mixing some incredible musical in Broadway?
I think in the US, there's a couple different paths. There's a lot of great university programs now, and that didn't exist when I was coming up. So there's a lot of folks that are going through some great sound design and programs in the university level. And that's an amazing opportunity to learn a lot about how we do this craft. I think once you get to New York, it is a union-based society once you get to the Broadway level. So you do have to navigate that, but getting into the shops, doing shop work, you're going to meet lots of people. and that's going to springboard you to other jobs. Off-Broadway is a great resource. There's a lot of great shows happening, and most of us sound designers that are doing stuff on Broadway are also doing stuff off Broadway. And there's a lot of folks that I work with that we met on an off-Broadway show and hit it off, and it was a great experience. And that's really a lot of what happens with operators. And, you know, whether it's an A1, A2 associate, it's, you enjoy working with someone. And once you have that good experience, then the next project that comes up and you're looking for someone, there's opportunities. So, you know, there's definitely a ladder, building your skills, listening, and being someone that is fun to be in the room with, but has the skills. You know, don't be cocky, and be a good team player.
Nice. What about the UK? I know you work everywhere in the world, Gareth, but you started in the UK. You've got a great organization as well, right? I presume people can move up through the Gareth Owen Sound Company. What qualities do they need to have? What skills do they need to have?
I tend to base my suggestion on how to get on in the industry based around how I did it, which is go out, get work experience, learn how it works, put yourself in a room with people, prove yourself to be useful, so that next time they're sitting there going, okay, we need an A3 for this show, okay, we need somebody to do this. You think, you know what, that guy we had last week, that girl we had over there, she was really good, let's get her in. And that's traditionally what I tell people. Now, I know there's all sorts of courses that you can do, and I think that's all beneficial. But I mean, if I was looking for the perfect person, it'd be the person who phones me, oh, maybe not phones me up, that would be a bit weird, but sends me an email saying, I've just completed a degree in network engineering, and I'm really good at setting up computer networks, but I did all of the sound for my university amateur dramatics club, and now I'd like to start at the bottom. Can I do work experience? I'd be like, this person, get this person in theatre right now. And that I can only really give advice based on what I did and what seems to have worked for so many people that I work with.
Nice. I guess, you know, maybe the last question, and this is the thing that interests me the most. I think I'm obsessive about sound. I know you two are, maybe even more than I am. I don't actually create the sources. Where do you look to find that extra little thing, the thing that makes something from being good to being great? You know, that special sauce. Peter.
Wow, you saved the best question for last.
I'm glad you got that one first.
Yeah, really. Think about your special sauce, Gareth.
Yeah. You can say there isn't any, you know.
I think it really connects back to that idea of sitting in that theater by yourself and closing your eyes, and what is the sound in your head. I think that most of us can hear a lot of what we're trying to accomplish in our minds, and whether it ends up turning out that way or not, you know, we'll find out on any given night. But you know, you want to have this visceral connection. You want to connect your audience to this piece, and the special sauce could be a sound effect that just makes everything gel together in that one moment and gives you chills, or it could be a reverb that has this wonderful tail that just gives emotion to what the singer is doing. But it's the same thing whether you're doing an album or a concert or a movie or a theater show. You're telling a tale, it's storytelling, and that special sauce is making sure that the job you're doing as a sound designer connects to the story that's being told on the stage, and that you are an extension of that. And if you can make someone emotional by the work that you're doing, and that emotion could be excitement or could be sadness, you have to be able to connect them using sound. That's our tool, that's our medium. How do we use sound to make an audience relate to what's happening on the stage?
Nice. Gareth, are you ever happy with it? Do you ever think, that's it, I've knocked it, that's just perfect, knocked it out of the park?
Never ever heard the sound like here in my head in the theatre or in the stadium ever. It always sounds better in my head than it is outside. I guess I'm destined to be disappointed forever in that respect. With regard to a special sauce thing, no, I don't have anything. I've got a slightly less philosophical answer than Pete, in that I have something that I rather arrogantly call Gareth's rule of 1%, which is that there's no one thing that you can do that's going to make a show sound 10% better, but there are 10 things that you can do that make it sound 1% better. And I just feel like my job is a constant step of 1%. So you know what, changing the threshold on that compressor, I might get 1% improvement out of that. Taking the whole orchestra pit out and putting double thick carpet down under the reed players, that might give me another 1%. Putting concrete paving slabs under the drums to reduce the resonance of the subs coming back into the kick drum mic, that might give me another 1%. Twisting that speaker a little bit to the left, maybe I get 1% there. Making the reverb tail on that longer, 1%, 1%, 1%, 1%. And that's what I'm doing. I mean, yes, of course, there are a few things that you can do that will improve your sound 10%, like the time I forgot to turn on the master delays for every amplifier in the theatre. I spent 10 minutes thinking, there is something really, really wrong with that. Turning that switch on, that's going to make your show sound 10% better. But most of the time, it's all about 1%. And so, yeah, that's my kind of, if I had a special sauce, it's all about 1%.
Brilliant. Listen, I hope the people who've been listening from all around the world to this conversation have enjoyed it as much as I have, because most of the time I thought there was just the three of us having a chat, and fascinating as I learned a bunch of stuff today. I can't thank you guys enough for sharing that with us. You know, I hope we can do this again. I've got half of the stuff I was going to ask you not asked, so absolutely fantastic. Chris, anything you want to add to that? Anything from the audience before we go? We're already over time.
And seeing the comments, I think everybody is still left in the room is 100% with you. It was jaw-dropping, fascinating.
Okay.
Guys, we really appreciate the opportunity to be able to have the chat, and it's been a lot of fun.
Really good fun. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming, Gareth. Thanks for coming, Peter. Been a joy. Thanks to Avid for sponsoring this, or whatever you call it, hosting this. It's been great. Okay, I think we're going to stop now. Bye, everybody. Thanks again.